Sign it, or I'll drag this out for years. The moment my cousin pushed those papers across the table, I thought they were trying to steal my $5.5 million penthouse. I was wrong. The apartment was only the beginning. A hidden inheritance, a staged legal trap, a midnight break-in, and a family's secret worth far more than anyone imagined would change my life forever. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, if your own family pressured you to give up your inheritance, would you fight back or walk away? And if you enjoy dramatic family stories with shocking twists and satisfying justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Now let me tell you what really happened. Sign it, or I'll drag this out for years. Those were the first words anyone said to me that afternoon. Not "I'm sorry for your loss." Not "please have a seat." Just a threat delivered with complete confidence, as if the outcome had already been decided before I even walked through the door. My name is Naomi Qureshi. I'm 33 years old, and I work as a commercial architect in Seattle. Most of my career has been spent restoring older buildings instead of designing flashy skyscrapers. I prefer preserving history over chasing attention, and I've always believed that if you work hard enough and stay honest, life eventually rewards you. I was wrong. Sometimes honesty simply paints a target on your back. 3 weeks before that meeting, my grandfather, Elias Qureshi, passed away quietly at the age of 86. He had lived the last decade of his life in a spectacular Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park. The apartment was valued at approximately $5.5 million, but to him, it was never about the money. It was home. Years earlier, a small electrical fire had damaged part of the residence. While everyone else suggested selling it, I flew to New York during my vacation and spent nearly 3 weeks helping coordinate the restoration. We worked side by side, every day. He taught me stories about the building, its original architects, and why preserving details mattered. Those memories became more valuable than I realized. A week after the funeral, the family gathered at my grandfather's longtime attorney's office in Manhattan for the reading of his will. Everyone looked confident. My uncles whispered among themselves. My cousins exchanged smiles. No one looked nervous. Why would they? For decades, everyone assumed the penthouse would become part of the family trust and eventually be divided among the relatives. Then the attorney opened the final envelope. I hereby leave full ownership of my Manhattan residence to my granddaughter, Naomi Qureshi. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The uncomfortable silence that arrives when every expectation in a room suddenly collapses. I felt dozens of eyes lock onto me. No one congratulated me. No one smiled. Victor Qureshi, my older cousin and the unofficial leader of our extended family, simply stared at me without blinking. Victor was 45 years old and controlled several family businesses. He had built a reputation as someone who always got what he wanted. He spoke confidently, dressed impeccably, and treated every conversation like a negotiation he intended to win. He finally broke the silence. There has to be some mistake. The attorney calmly shook his head. There isn't. Victor leaned back in his chair. We'll discuss this later. His tone sounded polite. His eyes did not. Over the next several days, my phone barely stopped ringing. Family members who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly wanted to reconnect. One aunt invited me to dinner. Another uncle wanted coffee. A cousin suggested we celebrate Grandpa's life together. Every invitation ended the same way. Someone eventually asked me what I planned to do with the penthouse. I politely avoided answering. The questions kept becoming more direct. Would I sell it? Would I share ownership? Would I do the right thing for the family? It didn't take long before I understood that nobody actually wanted to spend time with me. They wanted access to the apartment. I stopped answering calls. Exactly 11 days after the funeral, I received an email from a legal mediation service. The message explained that several family members wished to resolve minor administrative issues related to the estate before probate moved forward. Attendance was described as strongly recommended. Something about the wording felt strange. Still, I didn't want unnecessary legal complications, so I booked the earliest flight from Seattle to New York. The mediation wasn't held at my grandfather's attorney's office. Instead, It took place inside a luxury conference suite rented at a private business center in Midtown Manhattan. When I entered the room, Victor was already sitting at the head of a polished walnut table. 3 attorneys occupied seats beside him. A stack of neatly organized documents waited directly in front of an empty chair.
Mine.
No one stood to greet me. Victor gestured toward the chair. Glad you made it. I remained standing. What exactly is this meeting about? He smiled politely. Just paperwork. One attorney slid the documents toward me. Nothing complicated. I looked down. The title page immediately caught my attention. Property Transfer Agreement. My stomach tightened. I flipped through the pages. Several paragraphs discussed voluntarily transferring ownership interests. Another section released future inheritance claims. There were signature lines on nearly every page. I looked back at Victor. I'm not signing this. His smile disappeared almost instantly. He folded his hands together and leaned slightly forward. You haven't even read everything. I've read enough. His voice became colder. If you cooperate today, everyone saves time. I pushed the documents away. I'm keeping what Grandpa left me. Victor slowly picked up an expensive fountain pen and placed it directly in front of me. The room became completely silent. Even the attorneys stopped moving. Then Victor spoke the sentence that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. Sign it, or I'll drag this out for years. There was no shouting. No dramatic gestures. Just absolute certainty. As though he genuinely believed I had no choice. I studied every face around the table. None of the attorneys looked surprised. No one corrected him. No one suggested compromise. That was the moment I realized this meeting had never been about negotiation. It had been designed to pressure me into surrendering before I understood what I actually owned. I stood up. I'm leaving. Victor didn't raise his voice. Instead, he said something that made me stop at the door. You have no idea what Grandpa really left behind. I turned toward him. What does that mean? He gave a small smile. You'll find out. I waited for an explanation. None came. I walked out of the building confused, frustrated, and more suspicious than ever before. At the time, I believed Victor was simply trying to intimidate me into giving up a luxury apartment. I had no idea that his strange comment wasn't a threat. It was a mistake. Because by admitting there was something more than the penthouse, Victor had accidentally revealed that he knew secrets the rest of the family didn't. And before the next morning arrived, someone would break into the penthouse searching for whatever they believed my grandfather had hidden there. I barely slept that night. Victor's final words followed me all the way back to the penthouse. You have no idea what Grandpa really left behind. At first, I dismissed it as another intimidation tactic. Victor had always relied on uncertainty to control people. He wanted me questioning every decision before I made it. Still, something about his expression bothered me. He hadn't sounded confident because he was bluffing. He had sounded confident because he believed he already knew something I didn't. By sunrise, I was making coffee in the penthouse kitchen when I noticed something strange. One of the dining room chairs had been moved. It wasn't dramatic. Only a few inches. Most people would never have noticed. But I had personally arranged every piece of furniture after Grandpa's funeral while preparing the apartment for probate photographs. I knew exactly where that chair belonged. I slowly walked through every room. Nothing appeared missing. The paintings were still hanging. The antique watches remained inside their display case. The silver collection hadn't been touched. Even Grandpa's vintage record player sat exactly where I had left it. Whoever had entered hadn't come for valuables. Then I reached Grandpa's private study. The drawers were closed. The books remained on their shelves. But a faint layer of dust on the desk had been disturbed. Someone had searched the room carefully. My heartbeat accelerated. I immediately checked the small closet beside the study. Inside were several storage boxes, old blueprints, and a long metal document tube Grandpa had always kept locked. The tube was lying on the floor. I was certain I had left it standing upright. I picked it up. The lock had been forced open. My hands tightened around the cold metal. Someone had definitely been here. I opened the tube. Several rolled architectural drawings remained inside. But something felt different. The contents looked incomplete, almost as though someone had searched through them before leaving. I called building management immediately. Within 30 minutes, security officers arrived and reviewed the electronic access logs. Their conclusion surprised everyone. There were no signs of forced entry. According to the system, someone had entered the apartment using an authorized building credential shortly after midnight. That shouldn't have been possible. Only I, the estate attorney, and building management possessed temporary access authorization. The police documented the scene and collected fingerprints, although they warned me that clean professional searches rarely produced useful evidence. One officer looked around the immaculate apartment before speaking. Whoever came here wasn't stealing. What do you mean? They knew exactly what they were looking for. Those words settled heavily in my mind. After the officers left, I returned to the study determined to inspect everything myself. I spread every blueprint across the floor. Old renovation sketches, structural drawings, electrical diagrams. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something hidden inside one of the larger blueprints. The paper felt thicker near one edge. Carefully, I unfolded it. A sealed envelope slipped onto the hardwood floor. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's handwriting.
Naomi.
My hands froze. The envelope had clearly been concealed intentionally. If the intruder had searched only the tube itself, they had somehow missed it. I carefully opened the letter. Inside was a handwritten note. Naomi, if you're reading this, it means events unfolded exactly as I feared they might. Do not assume the apartment is the true inheritance. It never was. What matters is what this home has protected for decades. Trust no one who suddenly becomes interested in the penthouse after my death, especially anyone demanding quick signatures. There are records that explain everything. Someone will eventually come looking for them. If that happens, contact Daniel Reeves. He will know what to do. Daniel Reeves. The name stirred a distant memory. He had worked with Grandpa years ago during the penthouse restoration after the fire. I remembered him as a quiet construction manager who rarely spoke unless something important needed to be said. The letter included a phone number. I hesitated only a moment before dialing. The call went straight to voicemail. I left a brief message introducing myself. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Naomi? The voice sounded older than I remembered. This is Daniel. I found Grandpa's letter. There was a long silence. Then Daniel sighed. So, they finally made their move. I was hoping I'd never receive this call. We agreed to meet later that afternoon at a small cafe in Brooklyn. Daniel arrived wearing a faded navy jacket and carrying a worn leather briefcase. He looked tired but alert. After exchanging condolences, I handed him Grandpa's letter. He read it quietly before nodding to himself. He planned further ahead than anyone realized. What exactly did he leave me? I asked. Daniel looked around the cafe before lowering his voice. The penthouse was only the key. The key to what? He reached into his briefcase and placed a small brass storage key on the table. Years ago, your grandfather rented a secure archive warehouse. What's inside? Everything he believed someone would eventually try to erase. My pulse quickened. An hour later, we drove to an industrial warehouse in Brooklyn. The storage manager verified Daniel's identification before escorting us through rows of climate-controlled archive rooms. Finally, he unlocked one narrow storage unit. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Every shelf was packed with labeled document boxes, architectural records, contracts, engineering reports, property surveys, decades of carefully organized files. Daniel smiled for the first time all day. Elias trusted paper more than computers. We began checking inventory against an old archive list. Everything appeared intact. Until we reached shelf 7. One box was missing. Dust outlined exactly where it had once sat. Daniel's expression immediately changed. He didn't need to open the inventory list. He already knew which box had disappeared. What was in it? I asked. He slowly closed his eyes. The original redevelopment agreements. How important were they? Daniel looked directly at me. They're the only documents that prove your grandfather's ownership rights. A chill ran through my body. Someone hadn't broken into the penthouse looking for jewelry. Someone had broken in because they believed those records were hidden there. When they failed to find them, they had somehow located the warehouse first. I stared at the empty space on the shelf. Who would even know these files existed? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the warehouse entrance, as though making absolutely certain no one was listening. Then he spoke quietly. I know exactly who took them. The name he said next was someone I had never once considered a threat. The original redevelopment agreements were stolen by Richard Holbrook. I frowned. Richard? Daniel nodded slowly. He wasn't family. That surprised me even more. Richard Holbrook had served as my grandfather's financial advisor for nearly 25 years. He attended family holidays, birthday dinners, and even Grandpa's retirement celebration. Everyone trusted him because Grandpa trusted him, including me. I don't understand, I said. Why would Richard steal documents that belonged to Grandpa's estate? Daniel looked toward the warehouse entrance before answering. Because those papers are worth much more than the penthouse. We left the warehouse immediately. Neither of us wanted to discuss sensitive records inside a public storage facility. An hour later, we were sitting in Daniel's pickup truck overlooking the East River. Only then did he explain everything. Years ago, New York approved a massive redevelopment plan covering several commercial blocks near the waterfront. Most investors focused on finished buildings. My grandfather quietly purchased redevelopment rights attached to several overlooked parcels before anyone realized how valuable they would become. He never announced the investments. He simply stored every original agreement himself. As the neighborhood grew, Daniel explained, those redevelopment rights became worth a fortune. How much? He hesitated. Far more than the penthouse. My stomach tightened. So, Victor wasn't trying to take my apartment. Daniel shook his head. No. He wanted whatever legal rights those documents proved. For the first time, Victor's behavior finally made sense. The pressure, the fake mediation, the transfer agreement. None of it had ever been about giving the family a fair share. He wanted me to surrender ownership before I understood what I actually possessed. But how does Richard fit into this? I asked. Daniel sighed. Richard handled financial paperwork for years. If anyone knew where Elias stored confidential records, it was him. That evening I searched through Grandpa's old emails stored on a backup laptop. Most messages were ordinary. Bank statements, investment reports, holiday greetings. Then I noticed something unusual. 6 months before Grandpa died, Richard had repeatedly requested copies of certain redevelopment files. Grandpa had refused every request. His replies were short. No. We'll discuss this in person. The originals stay with me. Richard never argued in writing. The conversation simply ended. At least on email. The next morning, Daniel suggested we travel to Chicago. One of the engineering firms that prepared the original redevelopment surveys still maintained physical archives. If backup copies existed anywhere, they would likely be there. We booked the earliest flight. The engineering firm's headquarters occupied an aging brick building near the Chicago River. Its archive department looked more like a library than a corporate office. Rows of climate-controlled shelves stretched across the room. An elderly records director greeted us politely after reviewing Grandpa's authorization letter. When she searched their database, her expression immediately changed. Someone requested these files several months ago. Daniel and I exchanged a glance. Who? I asked. She rotated her computer monitor toward us. The request listed Richard Holbrook as the applicant. But another detail stood out. The authorization letter attached to the request claimed Richard represented Victor Qureshi. He tried to obtain certified copies? I asked. Yes. Did he succeed? She smiled slightly. No. Why not? Because your grandfather personally filed permanent restrictions years ago. She opened another record. The instructions were very specific. She adjusted her glasses before reading aloud. No redevelopment records are to be released to anyone except Naomi Qureshi after my death. I felt my throat tighten. Grandpa hadn't simply trusted me. He had planned for this exact situation. Daniel leaned closer. Was Richard informed his request had been denied? Immediately. What happened afterward? He never contacted us again. As we thanked her and prepared to leave, Daniel's phone vibrated. He answered. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. "What happened?" Asked after he ended the call. He looked directly at me. "Victor just filed an emergency petition in probate court." I frowned. "For the penthouse?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. He wants every inherited asset connected to your name frozen." I stared at him. "What inherited assets?" Daniel opened Grandpa's letter again. "You still don't know everything your grandfather owned." Before I could ask another question, my own phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar Manhattan law firm. I answered cautiously. "This is Naomi." The woman on the line introduced herself as a court clerk. "Ms. Qureshi, we're notifying you that an emergency hearing has been scheduled tomorrow morning regarding the estate of Elias Qureshi." "What exactly is the hearing about?" "I'm not authorized to discuss details." She paused before adding one final sentence. "But I strongly recommend that you attend." The call ended. Daniel stared through the windshield in silence. Something had changed. Victor wasn't behaving like someone trying to negotiate anymore. He was behaving like someone racing against time. That meant one thing. Somewhere hidden inside records we still hadn't found was evidence capable of destroying everything he had spent years building. The emergency probate hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. Victor's attorneys argued that unresolved ownership questions justified freezing every inherited asset connected to my name until the court completed its review. My attorney objected immediately. "There is no legal basis for this request." Victor remained unusually quiet throughout the hearing. He didn't look angry. He looked impatient, as though the courtroom itself was delaying something far more important. The judge denied Victor's request without prejudice, explaining that no credible evidence had been presented to justify such an extraordinary order. Technically, I had won. But as we walked out of the courthouse, Daniel didn't look relieved. "He expected to lose," he said. I stopped walking. "What?" Daniel glanced back toward the courthouse entrance. That hearing wasn't his real objective. Then why file it? To keep us occupied. The realization hit me immediately. While we spent 2 days traveling to Chicago and attending court, someone else had plenty of time to continue searching for whatever Victor still hadn't found. We rushed back to Manhattan. The first place we visited wasn't the penthouse. It was the building's management office. I wanted complete access logs covering the last 2 months. The property manager reluctantly agreed after reviewing documents from the estate attorney. Together we examined hundreds of electronic entries. Residents, maintenance crews, cleaning staff, contractors. Nothing unusual. Then Daniel noticed one repeated authorization. Insurance inspection. For separate visits, each lasting less than an hour. "What exactly do insurance inspectors examine?" Daniel asked. The property manager shrugged. "Mostly structural systems." "Do they enter private apartments?" "Not usually." Daniel pointed toward one inspection code. "What area did they inspect here?" The manager searched another database. His eyebrows slowly lifted. "That's strange." "What?" "The inspections weren't for the penthouse. They were for the original maintenance vault." I frowned. "What maintenance vault?" "The building was constructed almost 90 years ago." He pulled out an old architectural plan. Beneath the foundation, there's a secure archive room where early construction records, utility diagrams, and ownership documentation were originally stored. "I've lived here for weeks," I said. "I've never heard anyone mention it. Most residents don't know it exists." Daniel leaned over the blueprint. "Can we see it?" 30 minutes later, the property manager unlocked an old steel security door beneath the basement level. A narrow concrete corridor stretched into darkness. Dust covered nearly everything. At the end of the hallway stood another reinforced door protected by an electronic lock. The manager entered his code. The heavy door slowly opened. Inside were rows of steel shelving filled with weatherproof archive containers. Every box carried inspection labels dating back decades. Daniel walked slowly between the shelves. "Elias mentioned this room once," he whispered. "I thought he was talking about the old boiler archive." I examined several containers. Most held plumbing diagrams, electrical layouts, historic renovation permits. Nothing seemed connected to Grandpa. Then Daniel called my name. Naomi. I joined him near the back wall. He pointed toward a shelf containing several document cases marked with the building's original ownership company. Inside one weatherproof box sat hundreds of professionally photographed records. Each page carried certification stamps from an insurance preservation company. One folder immediately caught my attention. Redevelopment agreements. I opened it carefully. Every document missing from the Brooklyn warehouse had been professionally photographed years earlier. Certified copies. Every signature. Every contract. Every property map. Nothing had truly disappeared. Someone had stolen only the paper originals. The preserved image archive remained untouched. Daniel smiled for the first time since Chicago. They backed everything up. Before I could celebrate, another detail caught my attention. Every archive box included an access log. Visitors had been required to sign in electronically before opening protected records. The manager searched the database. One name appeared 4 times over the previous month. Richard Holbrook. Each visit lasted approximately 45 minutes. He was here, I whispered. Daniel nodded. He searched this vault after Elias died. The property manager looked confused. I assumed he was authorized. Who approved him? I asked. He checked another screen. No one. He used temporary credentials issued by an outside insurance consultant. Daniel frowned. Can you identify the consultant? The manager clicked through another page. Then his expression changed completely. That's impossible. What is it? I asked. The consultant company doesn't exist anymore. When did it close? It never officially operated. The registration was canceled because it used fraudulent licensing information. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Richard hadn't entered legally. He had created a fake consulting company just to gain access to this building. Daniel carefully photographed every access record using his phone. We need copies of all of this. The property manager agreed. Within an hour, we left carrying certified reproductions of the access logs, archive records, and preservation photographs. As we reached the parking garage, my phone rang. It was my attorney. His voice sounded unusually excited. Naomi, where are you? Leaving the building. Good. Because prosecutors just contacted me. I stopped beside the car. Why would prosecutors be involved? They've opened a criminal investigation. Into Richard? There was a brief pause. Richard is cooperating. My heartbeat accelerated. If Richard is cooperating, my attorney finished the sentence for me. Then someone much higher is now the primary target. I didn't need him to say the name. I already knew. Victor had spent weeks trying to erase documents that were never truly lost. Now the very records he failed to destroy had become evidence against him. And for the first time since Grandpa died, Victor wasn't controlling the story anymore. The criminal investigation changed everything overnight. For weeks, Victor had behaved like a man who controlled every conversation. Now he stopped making public appearances. Several executives from his companies quietly resigned. 2 law firms withdrew from representing him. Financial news outlets began reporting that state investigators had subpoenaed corporate records connected to businesses Victor had managed for years. The inheritance dispute was no longer the biggest story. It had become the doorway to something much larger. 3 days later, my attorney called. Victor wants to meet. I immediately answered. No. He insists it won't involve lawyers. Definitely no. My attorney remained silent for a moment. Naomi, I think you should hear what he has to say. That surprised me. Why? Because desperate people often reveal information they never intended anyone to know. After thinking it over, I agreed. The meeting took place inside a private lounge overlooking the Hudson River. I arrived early. 2 security officers remained outside the room while my attorney waited in another lounge nearby. Victor entered alone. For the first time in my life, he looked exhausted. His tailored suit was wrinkled. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. He looked nothing like the confident businessman who had ordered me to sign away my inheritance only weeks earlier. He sat across from me without speaking. Finally, he sighed. I made mistakes. I folded my arms. That's an interesting way to describe fraud. He ignored the comment. I came here to fix this. You had plenty of opportunities. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Victor slid a leather folder across the table. I didn't touch it. Open it. Inside were copies of financial statements, real estate holdings, stock certificates, ownership transfers. The total value was staggering. Victor quietly spoke. I'll transfer half of these assets to you. I looked at him carefully. In exchange for what? One agreement. What kind of agreement? You publicly state that this entire inheritance dispute was nothing more than a misunderstanding. I almost laughed. That's impossible. It doesn't have to mention the investigation. It doesn't have to mention Richard. It only needs to calm public attention. I slowly closed the folder. So, this was never about the penthouse. Victor lowered his eyes.
No.
I already knew the answer. Still, I wanted to hear him admit it. What were you really protecting? He stared through the windows, overlooking the river. My companies. From what? He hesitated. Then he quietly answered. Audits. The room fell silent. Victor continued speaking before I could interrupt. Years ago, I started moving redevelopment profits through temporary holding companies. At first it was legal. Later.
He stopped.
Later I convinced myself I could correct everything before anyone noticed. But they noticed. He nodded. When your grandfather refused to release those original redevelopment agreements, everything became impossible to hide. I finally understood. The documents weren't valuable simply because they proved ownership. They established the true timeline of every investment, every transfer, every company involved. Anyone comparing those records with Victor's financial reports would immediately discover years of manipulated transactions. The inheritance case hadn't created the investigation. It had simply uncovered evidence investigators didn't know existed. Victor looked directly at me. You can still stop this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're asking me to help hide financial crimes. I'm asking you to save the family.
No.
Think about everyone who depends on these businesses. I am. He leaned forward. If prosecutors continue, they'll continue. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. For years, Victor had presented himself as the family's protector. Now I realized he had been protecting only himself. He pushed the folder toward me one final time. Take everything. You'll never have to work again. I slid the folder back across the table. I already have everything I need. His expression hardened. You'll regret this. I stood.
No.
You will. Without another word, I walked toward the exit. Just before opening the door, Victor spoke again. You think winning this case changes anything? I looked back. It already has. Then I left. That was the last time I ever saw Victor outside a courtroom. The following week, prosecutors announced multiple charges involving fraud, falsified corporate records, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. Richard Holbrook formally entered a cooperation agreement. His testimony filled gaps investigators had struggled to explain. Corporate emails were recovered. Internal accounting files were restored. Several former executives agreed to testify. The case grew larger every day. News channels stopped referring to it as an inheritance dispute. Now they called it one of the largest commercial fraud investigations in the city's recent history. One evening, my attorney visited the penthouse carrying a thick folder. The judge has scheduled the final probate ruling. When? Next Monday. I looked around Grandpa's living room. Everything had started here. The threats, the break-in, the missing documents, the lies. Now only one hearing remained. In less than a week, the court would finally decide who legally owned the penthouse. But something told me that keeping the apartment would no longer be the most satisfying part of the story. The final probate hearing arrived on a rainy Monday morning. By the time I reached the courthouse, television cameras were already lined up outside the entrance. Reporters weren't there because of the penthouse anymore. They were there because Victor Qureshi had become the center of an expanding financial fraud investigation. For the first time since my grandfather passed away, I felt strangely calm. There was nothing left to hide, nothing left to fear. Only the truth remained. Inside the courtroom, nearly every seat was occupied. My attorney organized the final exhibits while Daniel Reeves quietly sat behind us in the public gallery. He gave me a reassuring nod. Without him, I never would have uncovered any of this. Across the aisle sat Victor. He looked completely different from the man who had once ordered me to sign away my inheritance. His expensive confidence had disappeared.
So had most of his legal team.
Only one attorney remained beside him. The judge entered, and the courtroom immediately fell silent. The proceedings began with a summary of the estate. Ownership of the Manhattan penthouse. Supporting documentation. The original will. Certified archive records. Insurance preservation copies. Electronic access logs. Every piece of evidence was now organized into a clear timeline. My attorney presented the final argument. The evidence establishes beyond dispute that Elias Qureshi intentionally transferred the Manhattan penthouse exclusively to Naomi Qureshi. The court has also received independent documentation confirming the authenticity of the redevelopment records connected to the estate. No legal basis exists to challenge either transfer. Victor's attorney offered a brief response. There was very little left to argue. The fraudulent transfer agreement had already been exposed. Richard Holbrook had admitted under oath that he entered the building using a fake consulting company. Electronic records connected Victor's office to multiple unauthorized document requests. Every attempt to undermine the estate had failed. After reviewing the evidence, the judge removed his glasses and looked across the courtroom. The court finds no valid grounds to contest the decedent's intentions. He paused before continuing. Full ownership of the Manhattan penthouse shall remain with Naomi Qureshi. A quiet wave of relief passed through me. But the judge wasn't finished. The court further orders that all fraudulent claims filed against the estate are dismissed with prejudice. That meant they could never file the same challenge again. The case was over. Completely. Victor slowly lowered his head. For the first time, he didn't object. He didn't interrupt. He simply accepted the decision. Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded everyone involved. I declined every interview. I had spent enough time watching people fight over headlines. I wanted my life back. Over the following months, the consequences unfolded one after another. Victor's companies entered court-supervised receivership, while investigators completed financial audits. Several executives accepted plea agreements after admitting they had altered corporate records under Victor's direction. Richard Holbrook permanently lost every professional license he held. His cooperation reduced his sentence, but it couldn't restore the reputation he had spent decades building. The fake consulting company that allowed unauthorized access to the building became one more piece of evidence in the criminal case. Every shortcut eventually caught up with the people who created it. As for me, I finally returned to the penthouse. For the first time since Grandpa's funeral, the apartment felt peaceful. No investigators. No attorneys. No security officers. Only silence. One afternoon, Daniel helped me organize every archive box my grandfather had preserved over the years. Thousands of architectural drawings, restoration notes, neighborhood photographs, and handwritten journals filled the study. Some documented buildings that no longer existed. Others preserved stories that would have disappeared forever. Looking through those records, I finally understood why Grandpa protected them so carefully. He wasn't preserving wealth. He was preserving history. Several months later, Daniel and I donated the historical architectural collection to a public preservation foundation, ensuring researchers and future architects could study the material instead of leaving it forgotten inside storage boxes. It felt like exactly the decision Grandpa would have made. The redevelopment rights remained part of the estate exactly as he intended. The penthouse remained my home, not because it represented luxury, not because it was worth $5.5 million, but because every room reminded me of the man who believed honesty mattered even when it wasn't the easiest path. Looking back now, I realize the inheritance was never the real lesson. The real lesson was this. Greed convinces people that destroying evidence can erase the truth. It can't. Eventually, facts outlive lies. Integrity outlasts manipulation. And patience often defeats power. Victor thought he was fighting to protect his empire. Instead, every dishonest decision he made destroyed it piece by piece. He lost his businesses. he lost his influence. He lost the respect he had spent an entire lifetime trying to earn. I kept something far more valuable: my grandfather's trust. And that's one thing no contract, no threat, and no amount of pressure could ever force me to sign away. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you enjoyed this story filled with family conflict, courtroom drama, unexpected twists, and satisfying justice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. Until next time, take care, and remember, the truth has a way of finding its way home.